Management workshop. There you go. Thank you. We're having a second workshop hosted by Spain Global, Forecast, the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management, I-DIEM, and the International Association of Emergency Managers, IAEM. So thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Camila Tapias, and I am a Global Disaster Resilience Specialist at Spain Global, and I will be your MC today. I'm very excited for today's workshop and the discussions that we will have. So really our goal for today is to facilitate an interactive workshop to advance efforts to use decision intelligence to provide emergency managers in the US with the information needed to make informed and more equitable decisions before, during, and after disasters. So the purpose and intended outcomes of the workshop are to first discuss how decision intelligence can ensure equitable hazard mitigation. Second, to create equity design requirements based on a flood scenario tabletop exercise. And third, to create and validate an open source decision intelligence model for emergency management, planning, resource management, and operational decision making. So really our way forward after this workshops is to continue the discussions about equitable decision intelligence in emergency management and to have clear functional requirements to inform our functional pilots that we'll have in the US and to create the first open source model that will be published and will make available for the broader audience. So just so you know, you will have different opportunities to provide feedback throughout the workshop, either through and after the workshop through our Microsoft Teams and our LinkedIn group. And also we'll have workshop evaluation forms that we'll provide for you to complete at the end of the workshop. So just so you're aware, we will share the link. So we want to get to know one another today, and so we want to have more productive and meaningful discussions that will move us in the right direction. So if you can please type in the chat your name, where you're from, your organization, your role, and what you hope to get out of today's workshop. So while you do that, I'd like to start with our organizations that are co-hosting the event, our facilitators, for them to introduce themselves. So Joel Thomas, if you want to start.
Sure, thank you, Camila, and good afternoon or good morning, good evening, depending which part of the world you're in today. My name's Joel Thomas. I'm the founder and CEO of Spin Global. We're a public benefit corporation that's based in Maryland. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion today and really look forward to just moving the needle collectively on a more equitable future in emergency management and figuring out how together we can develop and design solutions and processes to help us get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Nisim, you want to go next?
Yeah, hi, thank you, Camila. Thank you for having me today. My name is Nisim Titan. I'm the CEO of Forecast. I bring over 16 years of experience in development of decision intelligence and AI-based models and concepts for decision makers. A little bit about Forecast. Forecast was founded on the belief that decision makers today aren't properly equipped to make the right decisions. And this is one of our assumptions based on our firsthand experience with defense and emergency management. And this is why for the last 16 years, I have developed decision intelligence models based on AI to support decision makers. And hopefully we'll have today a fruitful workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Nisim. Curtis, you want to go next?
Hello, everyone. My name is Curtis Brown. I serve as State Coordinator of Emergency Management at the Virginia Department of Emergency Management, and I'm the co-founder of the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management, a nonprofit focused on increasing diversity in the field of emergency management, and also integrating equity and operationalizing equity within all phases of emergency management to improve outcomes for underserved and marginalized communities who are at the forefront of disaster risk. And so look forward to this discussion and how we can move forward as we face additional challenges in the future.
Thank you, Curtis. Sarah, I know you briefly said something in the chat, but if you want to briefly introduce yourself.
So I'm Sarah Miller. I am from the Seattle area. I'm here on behalf of the International Association of Emergency Managers. I'm the president of Region 10, and by day I'm a EM professional who does small business small government consulting and I'm a professor of emergency management and department chair at Pierce College in Washington State.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Eric. I know you already briefly introduced yourself. Thank you all for participating. And we have here from a lot of places, disaster preparedness, Rebecca, Anna, thank you so much for introducing yourself. We have someone else here in the waiting room, so let's wait till more people join. All right, so let's get started. So here I just want to, really emphasize that the first part of our workshop today, in the first hour, will be to frame the challenge and really scene setting for our workshop. And then the second half of the workshop will be more of a hands-on experience with a tabletop exercise where, we need you all to stay engaged and participate. And just a reminder, just only the first hour of this workshop will be recorded. So now I'm going to pass it over to Curtis and Sarah, who will start talking about equity and emergency management.
Thank you, Camilla. Again, my name is Curtis Brown, and glad to be a part of this conversation. Sorry, Joel and Brian, I couldn't get the background together, but I'm not a really good IT professional here. But I wanted to talk to you all about kind of framing the discussion around why equity is so important in emergency management. And it really relates to the history and legacy of government-related decisions that has increased vulnerability for communities of color, underserved communities, and that have been really exclusive in enhancing vulnerability for marginalized people, including people with disabilities, LGBTQ. And so if you look at this legacy of exclusion, along with this increase that we're seeing now of climate-related incidents, you can see why certain people consistently fail and why negative outcomes occur consistently. And embedded in our policies and programs are these issues of inequities and exclusion. Dr. Junia Howe, who is a partner of I-DIEM and a sociologist, did a really great study, and I believe she's been a part of this workshop before, that demonstrated how FEMA recovery programs increased wealth inequality because of the use of redlined data in information related to the housing values of different homes in communities of color compared to white communities, and how that helped to increase wealth inequality after disasters. And so we have to really ask ourselves as emergency managers, as we serve our very diverse communities, why does vulnerability exist in certain areas more than others? We have to look at the history of redlining, the decisions made related to transportation and where our highways are, data and research related to disproportionately putting communities of color in the floodplain, in and around toxic chemical plants and things of this sort. And so there's this long history of inequities related to policies and programs. And then, when you look at emergency management specifically, we started in as a focus of civil defense. And civil defense planning really focused around the threat of nuclear attack. And a lot of our focus was during the civil defense era, and I-DIEM has done a lot of research on this, protecting the suburban areas, and the understanding of who could prepare and mitigate and survive was really related to communities that had wealth and privilege. And so we have to really understand that in order to mitigate the losses for those who are most at risk, we have to be exclusive and really focus additional intentional attention on those who are at the front line of disaster impacts. Next slide, please. And so, and again, I think, are we going to play this video or?
Yeah, we're going to play the first 3 minutes.
Okay,
yeah.
great.
Hello, it is such a wonderful pleasure and great honor to be with you all today, even if it's virtual, and really get to share with you some of my work that intersects with emergency management and how we address disasters. As emergency managers, I know that you all are very familiar with an increasing conversation that really started with Hurricane Katrina and picked up again in more kind of thrust, if you will, with Hurricane Harvey and then Hurricane Maria, and of course, then most recently with COVID. And that is the discussion about inequalities and disasters and how we are addressing them. Much of the literature and the profession talks about inequalities and disasters like this. They say, well, disasters simply reveal the inequality. That is, society has inequality. All these different communities have lots of inequalities, and some communities are hit by natural disasters, be it a tornado or a fire or a hurricane, or now we're all being hit by a pandemic, right? And everyone kind of loses. The rich and the poor, privileged and unprivileged lose. But because everyone loses, the inequality is more dramatic. In other words, as I just said, disasters reveal inequality. They're not creating it, they're just showing it to us. However, much of our research actually isn't able to substantiate that. Let me explain. So historically, when we've researched disasters, we've really narrowed in to individual disasters after the fact, and we go in and we do lots of different kind of analysis to see what happens. These are really important studies. But because of it, we're only looking at those affected by disasters. And methodologically, statistically, whatever word you want to use, if we want to actually look at how disasters are impacting something like inequality, we have to use a comparative approach. So me and some of my colleagues a few years ago started this new approach where we use what we call a population-centered approach to look at disasters. That is, we look at the whole population, actually a representative sample of that population, but we look at everybody. And we are able, by looking at everyone, to find people and families who have really similar characteristics in their family structure, and their gender, and their race, and their neighborhood. The counties are very similar, all these different things that we know matter. But some of them have experienced lots of disasters, while others have not. What this comparison enables us to do is actually isolate the effect of disaster. But not only are we just looking across population, we also wanted to look across time. And by looking across time, we're really able to look in the long term. How are disasters affecting our communities? The third thing that we're able to do with our population-centered approach is we actually are able to trace people across time as they move. Now, of course, not everyone moves, but some people move. And by being able to trace them across time enables us really to be able to look more thoroughly at how disasters are affecting people. Think, for example, of people who were affected by Hurricane Katrina, moved from New Orleans to Houston, and then were affected by Hurricane Ike, and then later Hurricane Harvey. Obviously, those are much later, but these individuals in this long time period had multiple instances of being affected by disasters. So our approach allows us to capture all of that and look at a more fine-grained approach of how disaster and our response to disaster, FEMA aid, local aid, all those things, insurance, etc., are affecting communities. We use this approach to look at lots of different.
Back to you, Curtis.
Thank you. And again, Dr. Howe's research has been very much publicized. NPR and Congress has been looking into it, and FEMA has been looking into it to see how these inequalities and inequities are built into our programs and recovery programs, and how they really impact communities. And so we are really at a really important moment in emergency management as we face these continued major billion-dollar-plus events. The future is bleak in terms of heat waves and more disasters and flooding events. And it really requires us to take this research and knowledge related to inequities and update our plans, our doctrine, our policies, and prioritize from a human-centered focus the needs of those who are most at risk and are usually excluded. Emergency management is about saving lives, and these are the lives that are going to be most at risk. Next slide, please.
Hello.
And so when we talk about equity, there's a number of different definitions. FEMA recently defined equity as it relates to how they're going to embed it in their programs and policies as they consistent and systematic, fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals. And again, that's a good step in the right direction. And Administrator Criswell and the Biden administration is very much focused on integrating equity. A number of other definitions of equity truly goes to acknowledging the unequal starting places and the need to correct the imbalance. And again, the unequal starting places is directly related to government policies and programs that have supported the enhanced vulnerability. This is why equity is consistent with the ideals of government and improving services, of being fair and just to all that we serve. And so hopefully this workshop will help us to further understand how through our decision-making process, we can integrate equity to improve in a very intentional manner services that government provides for historically underserved and marginalized and vulnerable populations, both before, during, and after disasters, as we continue to face more frequent and severe disaster impacts. And with that, I'll pass it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Curtis. So let's talk for just a minute about who our historically underserved populations are. And there's a definition there that talks about populations that share a certain characteristic. But when you think about who is traditionally and historically underserved, there's a laundry list of them. And they include people who are already at a socioeconomic disadvantage. People with disabilities are routinely underserved in disasters. Ethnic minorities, communities of faith, the LGBTQ plus communities. There's scores of research on all of these groups that really showcase how they are often left behind. Our Native American tribes are often very much left behind in our disaster processes. And one of the things that's important to recognize is that there's a lot of intersectionality between these groups. They have common characteristics that cross over among various groups that are historically underserved. So if you are a disabled person who is socioeconomically disadvantaged already and a member of a tribal community, you have a much greater chance of being underserved because you are in so many of those categories. And it's a really important thing to think about. And I think that we've really experienced this during the pandemic too. People in rural communities are grossly underserved by our common processes. And it's a thing that we have to be aware of. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So we've talked a lot in the last 10 years about whole community principles and what those mean. And we talk a lot about them, but we have a lot of challenge in the field in actually implementing them because we still don't truly understand the needs of everyone in our communities, whoever those people are. And until we understand who is there and what their actual needs are, it is hard for us to meet their needs, to support what they are doing on a daily basis. We still tend to plan for our communities instead of with our communities. And this exacerbates the problem of underserved communities. Because when you look at it from a perspective of, oh, I'm going to write a plan for this group of people in my community, but I'm not going to ask them to be part of the process or ask them what they actually need, they become more underserved or additionally underserved because they weren't included in the process. And this idea of whole community is one of empowerment. It's one of interfacing with communities, asking what they're doing on a daily basis that gets them through their lives, and figuring out how to capitalize on that, expand on that, support that, instead of creating a whole new system or process because it's what we think is best. And we struggle with this. We struggle with this in disasters. We struggle with it in planning for disasters. We struggle with it within our organizations as well. Go ahead with the next slide. So any of you who've ever taken the CPG 101 manual and read it will recognize some of these concepts. So when we talk about accessibility, we're not just talking about access and functional needs. We are talking about the accessibility of our programs and our processes to everyone, to the entire community, to historically underserved populations. And these concepts boil down to people have the ability to self-determine what the best course of action for them is. And there is no one size fits all. That's where we struggle, is our planning processes end up being very rote often. And our communities are not. They are a multi-layered fabric of people and needs, and our process doesn't deal well with that. We want to make sure that not only people have equal opportunity, but equitable opportunity. There's a challenge in getting from equal to equitable, and treating everyone the same treats everyone equally, but it does not treat everyone equitably. And so this ideas of inclusion and integration, making sure that truly we are welcoming everyone, and we're doing our very best to serve all of their needs through a variety of things. This might be program change, it might be policy change, it could be legal changes. There's a lot of things that get us to this point. And we are still really in the baby steps in many places in this country of getting this right. And so the idea of accessibility should thread through everything that we do, but should not just be limited to the things that we traditionally consider accessibility and access and functional needs. And with that, I turn it back to Curtis.
Thank you, Sarah, and those are great points. And again, equity is really about giving people what they need, and because of the historical inequities, we may have to give, and most likely have to do more and give more resources to those who have been marginalized historically. And so disrupting inequity, there's a couple of recommended steps here. Acknowledging the hidden bias, and we discussed here acknowledging the history and the systemic and structural nature of biases and marginalization that has occurred. Understand and assess outcomes of bias, design equitable approaches, and develop, test, and evaluate for equity. And as Sarah mentioned, it has to be an inclusive process. A lot of the times you hear diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity and inclusion are very critical, important steps to promote equity. When you have diverse individuals around the table from the start, they are included in the process. More than likely, you're going to have a more equitable outcome because of the diversity and inclusion has been core to the process. And again, if you research the history of inequitable policies and programs and laws, they did not include women or people of color or people with disabilities. And of course, you get the inequitable outcome. And so you have to really be intentional in doing that. It's not easy. It takes work building relationships with marginalized communities and building trust, and because there's legitimate lack of trust of government and government organizations and entities because of this long legacy and history. So it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be magic. It takes work, but the impact, the result is what we're looking for. Building positive relationships within emergency management limits the negative impacts of disasters and truly builds resilience, which is what we're looking for. And promotes justice for all of our communities. And so with that, I'll pass it back over to Camilla and for the next part of our discussion.
All right, well, we're gonna have a poll for all of you. Thank you, Curtis. So please get your fingers ready. So do you use equity and inclusion practices as part of your decision-making right now? Yes, no, or unsure? Just give it a few moments for all of you to participate. All right, a few more seconds. Awesome. Thank you. So 82% of you said yes, 18 no. Great. Well, thank you all so much for participating. And thank you, Sarah and Curtis. So now we'll turn it over to Joel and Eric, who will frame decision intelligence in the US.
Thank you, Camila, and good to be with you all today. Want to provide some scene setting remarks as we're doing this first hour of this workshop to just set the landscape before we spend the last 2 hours really diving in to sort of the interactive component here. If you go to the next slide, just want to couple of definitions here, and what are we talking about when we talk about decision intelligence, and thinking about the context of what Curtis and Sarah just shared. I want to make a couple of disclaimers. First being, data and technology alone are not going to solve, they're not a silver bullet, right? We're not going to solve the equity problems we have in emergency management through these solutions. But what we do seek to do is see what we can do to create more equitable outcomes and actually understand the environment. As we saw in that video from Junia Howell, if we could look at all those different dimensions and the dimensions that Sarah and Curtis highlighted, knowing that our best data available, it was collected with a certain methodology, and there's certain inherent bias in any data collection effort. So we have to acknowledge that. But can we understand and develop a framework that can get us to a point where when we're tired, dirty, and hungry, and we have limited resources, we can get some directional insights that actually point us to recommendations and equity considerations, as whether it's before disaster, we're doing planning, or preparedness or mitigation efforts, or even during a disaster in the response phase, or during long-term recovery. So when we talk about decision intelligence, we're fundamentally talking about this idea of using data from a lot of different sources, pulling it all together, and actually developing models and tools and algorithms that spit out some results that will hopefully point us toward what we're designing. And NISIM's going to spend a lot of time talking about our model assumptions, right? If we have garbage in, we're going to get garbage out. So the idea here is we're trying to create a model that on the front end accounts for all the different equity considerations. So when we're pulling in data, we're actually able to identify those biases and flag them, and ultimately get recommendations that are sensitive to those biases and actually account for them in a certain way. So our focal point here in this workshop and through this initiative is to create and validate an open source decision intelligence model, during the planning, resource management, operational decision-making phases, and specifically around hazard mitigation. Open source is really important because I think, a lot of artificial intelligence, decision intelligence efforts tend to be sort of behind closed doors. And with this issue of equity, it's really important that we build trust. And I think one of the ways we do that is by putting all the cards on the table, identifying together, what are those inputs and outputs, and putting it to the crowd, putting it to the community to really define. So next slide, please. When we talk about, so the journey to get there, you start with data. All these, use the Lego analogy here. You've got all sorts of random bits and colors and sizes and shapes, and none of them match. As you sort of try to make sense of it, you begin maybe to sort them by category and kind, and we sort of got ideas of how do we need to sort them. Then you begin to think about how to arrange them and present visually. And at the end of the day, how do we create an ecosystem that fosters and creates equitable conditions? And so, cute little diagram here to give you an idea of what we're trying to do conceptually with a complex idea into something as simple as Legos. Next slide, please. When we talk about removing human bias, we have to recognize that we all bring social location to the conversation. Each one of us has a different story, a different journey. And I think when we talk about predictive modeling and trying to look at different outcomes, our goal is for that to be neutral. And the reality is predictive models are trained by people and by algorithms they're created by people with worldview. And so the idea is, we need to acknowledge that, as Curtis said, and actually identify, okay, where is the bias and what's missing? and let's look at that. And we need to look at algorithms that actually remove that bias, because I'll be honest with you, the real holy grail here is let's do more equitable data collection. Like, let's have a better equitable process. The reality is that's going to take a long time. I'm committed to it. It has to happen. I think it's going to take 5-10 years, a generation to, do that collectively. I think there's some stuff that can happen today and tomorrow. Let's do that. But in terms of getting comprehensive data needed to, manage disasters at scale, it takes time. So the idea here is with the data we do have and with technology available, how can we flag for things that are clearly, out of the boundaries of what we would consider equitable, and get towards a more equitable, not a silver bullet equitable, but a more equitable series of insights, and ultimately create recommendations that would provide benefit to the whole community. So if we're looking at funding a program, designing a project, from who should be engaged, as Junia talked about, looking at that population perspective, as Curtis talked about, who needs to be at the table? If people aren't at the table and having a chance to weigh in and shape, their voice is not going to be heard and reflected, even if by proxy. Proxy is, better than nothing, but it's better to actually engage the whole community, and that's hard work and work that needs to be done, and is necessary for removing human bias. Next slide, please. So as we talk about sort of model design considerations, we're going to get into this, and I-DIEM's going to get a lot more into it. Really, there's some inputs, from the natural environment. I'm talking about things like floodplains. Social environment, I'm talking about things like demographics, things that Sarah talked about with regard to disabilities, access, other functional needs, race, gender, age, etc. The built environment, we're talking about things like buildings, and infrastructure, roads, bridges. The economic environment, everything from jobs and business and industry, understanding to ownership, and looking at things like impacts to women-owned, minority-owned businesses, et cetera. And then the cyber environment. From an analysis standpoint, how do we take the data, which in the perfect world would all be equitable coming into this process, but it's not. How do we clean for the bias based upon locations and hazards and impacts of disasters, develop models that then we can run, and I-DIEM will share how they can run 1,000 model options in 60 minutes for different scenarios before, during, and after disasters. They've done that for 20 years in Israel and around the world. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, the output we're looking for is simple potential courses of action that are more equitable, and recommendations, and then an evaluation. Like, when we did that action, did it actually result in the equitable outcome we hoped for? So, really looking at this all the way to evaluation. So those are some of the basic framework considerations as we think about model design. Next slide, please. This is just a sample of, a very, very crude, example of, what might that look like if you're looking at like flooding and lifelines. You might get 3 different scenarios if a comparison of a flood and its impact to different community lifelines. And this is just the top level, needing to add in here, of course, all those social and economic and natural and built environment variables here, but looking at, what are different scenarios and what are some insights that you might get, and how might that direct attention, time, and resources. And so at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about, is having data, having scenarios, recommendations, understanding if we're able to overlay and understand where the vulnerable communities are, where the historically marginalized communities are relative to these scenarios, how will it affect those communities, and how will a particular course of action affect those communities, and can we select courses of action that are going to yield more equitable outcomes? Next. And just another note here, FEMA's done a lot of work on developing decision support architectures, and we want to build on and extend that. And I think there's models in the case of flood decision support, for example. We're going to talk about that today. And there's been efforts that really, from the recovery and even mitigation standpoint, where there's a lot of TBD sort of models and data sets, and there's work going on each one of these. But really, what are the impacts to the economy, health, housing, infrastructure, natural cultural resources, community planning? We really need to look through all these dimensions and take it from there. I do want to just pause and invite my colleague Eric Kant to provide any comments on this decision intelligence discussion.
No, brother, you've been holding it down pretty good. The only thing I'd really add to it is that we know the model making process is not going to be easy. And models are going to ask all the questions and want all the answers that we may not want to to answer. But it's almost a requirement. Just like all disasters are local, our models need to be local, and the models need to include the diversity of the community, or your models will be making inequitable courses of actions right from day one. And by adding equitable components, we are very hopeful that we don't run into the same challenges that have happened in other domains like law enforcement with machine learning algorithms and biasness in simple things like facial recognition that are no longer being used in those fields because they are so far off. If we can't come up with a model that is transparent and trustworthy, I don't think as decision makers, we can then in good faith use that model to help our constituents. So, and I'll throw it back to you, Joel. We'll have plenty of time for a deep dive into the technical pieces.
Sounds good. Thank you. I think next slide, we might be transitioning to another poll question.
Yeah, thank you, Joel and Eric. So yeah, we have another poll for you before we move forward with an introduction to model design. So we'll launch it here. So do you currently use a decision intelligence framework to inform and support your decision-making progress? Yes, no, or unsure. All right, give it a few more seconds for all of you to participate. Really some time to think about the question. All right, we're gonna give it 10 more seconds. Great. Well, thank you all. 14% of you said yes, 71% no, and 14 unsure. All right. So yeah, I'm going to pass it over to Nisim now, who's going to talk about model design. The floor is yours, Nisim.
Thank you, everyone, again. So let's start with the basics. What's an equitable decision intelligence model? So if Camille, you can put the next slide, please. So let's start with the basics. So what's a model? So a model actually is a framework that supports decision making. And if we want, like Eric mentioned, to have a transparent model, because that's the main issue. So we can check our data, we can validate our data, we can see if it's equitable, we can see the diversity of the data, we can see if there's biased data, and we could put red flags before we support recommendations. So we need to put it in three main layers. The first layer is the data layer, where we will have attributes, metrics, and KPIs that we will organize in some kind of tree model. And the idea here is to measure everything, our lifelines, our preparedness, our demographic data, and so on. The second layer is analyzing the data, taking our situation, our preparedness level, and running it in different scenarios according to different threats, like a flood, like a wildfire, forecasting and trying to run predictive simulations and understanding the outcome by running like Monte Carlo simulations, running the same scenario thousands of times. And the third layer is actually the recommendation layer. We'll get provided a list of different recommendations and options and what should we do and how should we invest in preparedness so we don't have too much to invest in recovery, for example. Next slide, please. Here's a little bit of definition. So we have our attributes that are immutable characteristics of someone or something. So that's like an entity running in the game, a behavior of a person. We have our metrics that are measurements of quantitative assessments. And we have our KPIs that's a group of different metrics together. So we can measure them, like for example, preparedness or some kind of lifeline, like transportation can be a KPI. And then we have our model, that's an entire decision analysis method for analyzing metrics, KPIs, and a variety of different simulations and predictive analysis, so we can try to predict some kind of outcome of an event. Next slide, please. So how can we build an equitable decision intelligence model? So what you see here are the 5 layers when we build decision intelligence based on AI. So of course, our first layer is the data layer, the big data layer, where we take tons of data and we try to validate it and see that it's equitable. The second layer is taking this data and making it information data. And that where comes our first layer of our model, the preparedness and readiness models. So here we will have our lifeline models, our first responder models, our emergency management models. The third layer is the knowledge. How can we take this information and make it knowledgeable for us? So here we will have behavior models running in scenarios. What's a behavior model? How does a crowd react in some kind of event? How do we evacuate people? How does a flood react? And so on. The fourth layer is the wisdom layer. That's where we implement AI algorithms to support our decision-making process. And the last one is the decision intelligence one, the equitable decision intelligence model, where we run our questions. And we'll see it in a few minutes, how we set our goals and how we start building those models. Next slide, please. So remember, prediction is at the core of decision-making. And if we try to predict scenarios and outcomes, so our main goal is mitigating a disaster. And for example, if we run some kind of flood scenario in Baltimore, we can predict the damage to lives and infrastructure and how much recovery it will cost us. And this is trying to think about the model. So beginning of building the model is actually going to the end and saying, okay, this is the result, this is the outcome, this is how much damage a flood can make in Baltimore, for example. Let's go back and start thinking about preparedness. What should we have done in infrastructure, in training our community, in investing in preparation, so we won't have such kind of disaster when we have an event, so we'll be better prepared. Next slide, please. What you see here is actually called the OODA loop. This is how we design our model. OODA loop was invented by a firefighting pilot from the US military in the 1950s. And the idea here is how we make decisions. So the first issue, the blue side, is we observe. We have some kind of rules of engagement, our doctrine, how we behave, and the understanding that we have from the situation. The green part is our orientation. So our traditions, our generic heritage, our historical data, our experience, our diversity from what kind of community we came. People from Israel behave differently from people from Australia or from the US. And then we make some kind of decision according to the situation, and we take some kind of action, and it goes back forward. And now I'll show you it on our model. Next slide, please. So our decision-making process is actually an agent-based simulation with optimized algorithms based on Markov chains. So the idea here is, if we look on the right side, we have a task in the red. We receive some kind of task. For example, I'm an emergency manager, and my responsibility is evacuating people because there's a big flood. And the decision-making process is based on sensing, then from things that I can see with my eye, things that I can understand from the environment, from people, communications, what kind of information I receive at the event itself. And the problem solving part, because it's in a model and we want to take the men out of the loop, will be a heuristic model running our doctrines and behaviors, our physical models, and so on. Then I'll take some kind of decision, there will be an action, it will come back. And on your left, what you're seeing is the Markov chain. The idea here is that we have a lot of states. So now everything is calm, and this is the preparedness level of my county, for example. And now there's a wildfire that started in the environment. So this is the first state, and I make one decision, and then there's another event, and the second decision, because as all of you are very experienced, you know that an emergency event is not a 15-minute event, and it can be an ongoing event. Just look at this pandemic, how much it's changed for the last 2 years, for example. Next slide, please. Here, before we go to the model, I just wanted to show the model in the FEMA 6-step planning process. So the first step is form a collaborative planning team. So the idea, first of all, is bringing all the stakeholders and mainly operational people to the table and start asking them the right questions, or let's call it the hard questions, about how they want to be prepared. Usually, the technical people, the data science, they come at the end. First of all, let's talk to the people, the people that work with the community, people that work with the state, people that have been in events. Let's ask them the hard questions and we will get some great answers. Let's understand our situation. For what should I be prepared? Let's determine our goals. What's the goal? Our goal is saving lives. Our goal is mitigating a disaster. Later on, we can plan the development, plan the preparation, and of course, plan implementation and maintenance of our operational planning. Next slide. So here is the first step for building our equitable decision intelligence model. And our first step is actually our last layer, the third layer. So first of all, let's build our team. Let's bring all the stakeholders to the table. Let's talk to all the decision makers. Let's ask them all the hard questions. Let's understand our situation. And let's try to define the model goals. So here I put some kind of example, what I would put as major goals, mitigating the disaster, saving lives, predicting the damage and recovery costs, what stakeholders' needs, gaps, main pains according to their position, if I'm an emergency manager, a first responder, if I'm in state level or city, define the threat, build a scenario, and build the preparedness. What are the primary inequities and what actions would improve equity outcomes? Those are the questions that actually we would do in a roundtable, and we will talk a little bit about them today with you guys and get your insights from your experience. Next slide, please. The second step, our second layer actually, is identifying our threats. What are our threats? What are our risks? Flood, hurricanes, pandemic, wildfire, and of course, I believe in each area, each state, it will be, number one will be floods or number one will be wildfire according to where you're living. Next slide. And after we know our threats, so what kind of information we need to gather for a threat? So here's an example of, we take a threat definition. So we need to have a mission statement, service checklist, concept of operation for that threat, key decisions by phases, cascading impacts, courses of actions, and of course, critical information requirements. And we'll talk about the data later on. Next slide. Later on, what kind of behavior models we need? Remember, I told you we need to run predictive simulations. So we need to run our model as close as real life situations. So do we have hazmat models, crowd behavior models? Crowd behaves in different ways. They have 4 phases of behavior, from day to day, from when started an event and when first responders come. First responders behavior, weather behavior. How does our weather affect if it's a hurricane, if it's a fire, if it's a flood, and so on? Do we have those models? Next slide, please. The next slide is our step 3, but this is the first layer of the platform. And this is the most important layer. This is the layer that will make the model be transparent. This is the layer that will clean the BIOS. This is the layer that will need to validate the data. This is actually the layer where we will build some kind of standard and try to understand and make the data equitable and clean all the BIOS. And if not, before making a decision, put some kind of red flag. So the phase is asking ourselves, what are the community and organizational preparedness, mitigation, and resilience needs according to the threats and hazard scenarios? Which models can support preparedness, mitigation, and resilience? How to connect all the preparedness models to the incident response and recovery to ensure equity before, during, and after disasters. And I put here just 4 examples. There can be 8 or 10 or more models, but the main ones, from my point of view, are the Lifeline models. And getting into each one of them, energy is a concept, healthcare is one, transportation, and so on. How do we work on each one of them? What kind of metrics? How can they be equitable? Our service models that we need to support our community, our readiness models. How am I as an emergency manager or first responder ready? And of course, our core capabilities model. And we can ask ourselves a lot of questions, like, for example, the demographic of our community. And for example, a very important metric from what I've learned from other workshops that we did, the diversity of my team. Is my team diverse enough to work with the community? Is there diversity in the community? And ask yourself all those questions. Thank you, Camila.
Thank you, Nisim. So we have another poll for you. So please get your fingers ready here. So are there any of your current data or technologies configured to provide actionable recommendations and intelligence? Yes, no, or unsure. If you said yes, please provide examples in the chat so we're aware of what you're talking about. Just give it a few more seconds for you to respond. All right, so 23% of you said yes. We would love to hear from you. 54 said no, and 23% said unsure. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for participating. So now we're going to go into take a 5-minute break so we can be active and engaged for our tabletop exercise. We'll really need you to get engaged here. Will be a hands-on experience. So we'll see you in 5 minutes.